panel that we've ever done starting, when was that? January. Yeah, starting this year. So starting in January. And we also will record this and it will become a podcast. And the podcast is called 911 Wonder Women's Empower Panel. And you can listen to that on Spotify, Apple, and iHeartRadio. So there is the link to that. And we'll make sure we post both of those when we post right after this. Our Empower panels exist because we like to take topics that aren't talked about nearly enough, in our opinion, and get a group of women together and just talk it out with you. Please feel free to comment in the comment area whenever you have a question or a comment. We also have a question tab there at the bottom if you want to submit a question at any time. We will keep our eyes on that. Otherwise, we are going to let the conversation just flow. So I didn't introduce myself. My name is Sarah Weston. I am the founder and executive director of 911 Wonder Women. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, the one, the only Samantha Hawkins. So Samantha, I'm going to hand it over to you. And thank you very much, everyone. And please enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sarah, our Commander-in-Chief of the 911 Wonder Woman Army. Hi, Amy. So glad for every single one of you joining in, man. And I have the easy job here facilitating the conversation between these wonderful voices and leaders in the industry, including Dr. Hayes, who is bringing her expertise and knowledge from a scientific perspective. So Samantha Hawkins, everybody knows me as Sam. I am the communications training officer and the training tech here at Cobb County Department of Emergency Communications. And we're going to go ahead and circle around, starting with Miss Keely and ending off with you, Dr. Megan Hayes. Please introduce yourselves, ladies.
Hi, everybody. I'm Keely Heyman. I'm the executive director of Mountain Valley Communications Center in New Jersey. We are technically a little bit of the northern Jersey section. If you are actually from New Jersey, you know that there is no actual central New Jersey, but we'd be closer to central than we would be northern. I've been in public safety. If you include my time in the street as an EMT and paramedic student, I never actually finished, but I've been doing this about 26 years now. I've been in the 911 center. I'm approaching my 24th year. And so here I am with these wonderful, glorious women, and I never would have imagined that I could be in a place where we are now lifting up our dispatchers instead of kind of just putting in the just a dispatcher category. So I am on vacation, so I do apologize. I'm at a campground. so you may see some of that. I was going to go up to the dock and do this from the bay, but I thought that would be unfair for some of you. But so that's me.
Lovely. Well, I still love the view, so.
I will happily walk you out, Samantha, to the dock, and you can take a look at the bay with me.
Thank you. Valerie Miner, by the way, in case you don't introduce yourself as such, she is an amazing chair of the Marketing and Communications Committee for 911 Women. I'll tell you what, and by the way, if you're not following Valerie's articles on LinkedIn, I don't know who you are. I disown you. But seriously, you need to be following her articles. She is an amazing writer as well. And Valerie, I can't do you justice like you can do yourself. Please tell us about you.
Oh, Sam, that was so wonderful. Thank you so much. And Keely, it's great to know that someone is on vacation, especially in the world you work in. So, as Sam said, I am Valerie. I do serve on our Marketing and Communications Committee. And my experience with dispatch has been for 13 years. I worked for a large university, mostly known for parties and football. So Roll Tide. And I left that job December of 2021 and now work for their sister school, which is one of the best medical schools in the nation. there I work in our wellness office. I create wellness content. I support our chief wellness officer and our other directors in the office. But this topic is important for me. I know a lot of people, when they think of post-traumatic stress, they think of, especially in the workplace, they think of people who do highly stressful jobs, first responders, healthcare workers. And, that's what we're here to talk about today. But also, I think it's important to note that it's always also experienced in other ways. I experienced post-traumatic stress, and it wasn't in the way that you may imagine from my 911 career answering those phone calls and stuff, but more so it was in the culture of the workplace. And I think that is something that we need to focus on as well too. And Megan can really add to that conversation. I work with Dr. Hayes in the wellness office too. I've learned so much from her already, and I look forward to learning more from her in this conversation. And Keely, if you haven't read her blog from September about I was in an abusive relationship with my employer, I think I'm going to look it up right now and put the link in the chat so you can look it up and read it. So I really do look forward to listening to what everyone has to say. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hayes now.
Thanks, Valerie. I'm Megan Hayes, and Valerie invited me to come and be a part of this panel today. And I'm really excited about it because 911 dispatchers is a group that I haven't really been able to interface very much with, but I can only imagine is exposed to a significant amount of trauma, and especially as I've done some more research in that area. But I have worked a lot with other types of first responders. I've worked with firefighters, I've worked with EMS, and of course, over in the UAB Medicine Office of Wellness, I've done a lot of work with our healthcare workers. And, since we're coming off the heels of, I guess we're endemic now, but of the pandemic, of course, they had many traumatic experiences that they were already a group that exposed a lot, but they had many traumatic experiences at the peak of the pandemic, especially those working in like critical care settings. But it seemed to really impact so many of the healthcare workers all across the hospital, from, the people working in maintenance to the folks who were, of course, on the front lines. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, working in the Office of Wellness. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I'm an associate professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham in our School of Medicine. And, the department that I work in when I'm not working in the Office of Wellness is the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehab. So I work in a medical rehabilitation center, Spain Rehabilitation Center, which is UAB's acute inpatient rehab. And so my expertise really is in trauma, right, and traumatic events. So I work with a lot of folks who have been in, things like car accidents and or had a traumatic brain injury or a spinal cord injury, or those types of kind of life-changing injuries and new disability that they have to adjust to. So my expertise has kind of been shaped in trauma from that population, but also now in my work in the healthcare sector. So I'm happy to share what I know about trauma and PTSD, and maybe as it applies to your group as well.
That is incredible. And so I thank you all for all your introductions. And obviously, I think it's clear why this panel, we have every single one of you is so important to have you here. So what I first want to start off with you, Keely, and then we're going to circle around and kind of go across, talking about how do you put it into words? How do you communicate what you're feeling in this, when you're feeling these feelings of burnout or PTSD? You may not know it as those words. That may not be what comes to mind, but what does it feel like? So you in a leadership role, but someone who has, been on the front line, and circle around to ending off with Dr. Hayes. What is it actually put into scientific terms and giving it, these names? But let's start off with you, Keely. What does it look like? What does it sound like, to have these kind of symptoms?
So I think that initially you may not know what it is. I had very intrusive thoughts. I don't function in the same, I'm a mom, So I don't function in the same thoughts of like a typical mom who's just like looking to have fun. I'm always looking for what's going to fail, what's going to happen next, where's the emergency, what's happening, and it took me a long time to understand that what I was experiencing was actually not normal, and that the vast majority of humans aren't experiencing those moments of vicarious trauma, if you will, because we are not in that space as normal humans who have seen and heard and dealt with life's trauma that do happen on a daily basis. So I think initially you may not even know what you're experiencing. I think, as Valerie mentioned in my article, I talk about not really understanding the things that I was experiencing, even in a toxic work environment. And I didn't know that what was happening was wrong because to me, it was my normal. And I think understanding what a baseline is for you is not static. It's not the same as what it might be for Valerie or what it might be for Dr. Hayes or even what it might be for you, Sam. It's understanding that all of us experience these different levels of trauma, post-traumatic stress at different varying degrees. I didn't experience it well into my career. I was fine as far as I knew, as far as I thought anyway. I was completely fine. You know, I had found ways to manage it or thought I was managing it well. It didn't actually rear its ugly head for me until many years later. I think I was probably in my 14th, 15th year of my career where I started realizing that I was struggling. I was struggling in the face of just what normal meant, because what we do and what we experience every day and the extremes, the highs and lows that we experience aren't what other people experience. And I think I noticed it. I think I was at a party and somebody asked me, "Oh, you're 911 dispatcher. What is that like? What's the worst thing you've ever heard?" And I remember staring at the person just blankly, like, why would you want to ask that question? Why would you want to know that information? And I think that's when the first time that I realized that, like, because I laughed it off, right? Like, to me, it was funny. And then I realized when they're staring at me after I've explained my worst call and they're looking at me with that look of like horror and shock. And I'm like, oh, that's not normal. You guys didn't know that? Like, you didn't know that's what I might see. And I realized then that maybe I was finding this deep-rooted dark humor in things that probably shouldn't have had a humorous tone to it. And then it was working in, I actually worked with a therapist on Talkspace. And I know I've talked about that in other podcasts that I've done. For me, writing made more sense, and that may not work for everybody where you might want to see somebody face to face. But for me, it was in that Talkspace environment because I was able to write it out and go back and reread it and go back and cover the things that I wasn't sure. Because, you know, I get a 45-minute session face to face, and I wasn't sure what that would look like, and I would miss things. And if I didn't make notes, it was just better for me to write it out, get a clear thought out, and be able to talk on all the bullet points. And I think it was in that experience that I started noticing that my dark humor was a little bit too much. And maybe I was not processing as well as I thought I might have. And I think that it's important for us to understand that however you choose to process it, whatever that means, as long as it's in a healthy way, that's okay. But when you're not actually processing and when you're not actually sure what that looks like or how you're supposed to be processing it, I think those are certain indicators, certain triggers that you may not, again, your baseline, your normal may be saying that this is okay, but it may not be okay. And that's why I find it very important, especially in leadership roles or in other spaces of the planet, even if you're not in leadership, if you're listening to your coworkers talk and something sounds a little bit off with them, or they're doing something that maybe isn't their normal, it's important to hone in on that a little bit. Hone in on what it is that is normal for your coworkers, is normal for your employees, and normal for your team. And if there's something that seems to be a little bit off kilter or a little bit maybe too dark, it might be time to reel that person in. It may be time to talk to them and encourage the ability to talk about it, because I feel for a very long time, and you know, and in all capacities, right? Like right now, there's this poor Texas dispatcher who is all over the news this morning. I don't know if any of you caught that. Again, toxic work environment, I'm sure of it. And, you know, there's just something to be said about even your environment can not help flourish or control your feelings in a sense, because you might spiral in the same environment that everybody else is spiraling in. So it's important to bring yourself back to center, and whatever that center might look like for you. And it may be that sarcastic, normal, like darker humor that we have, but don't let it tip. Don't let it get in the way of who you are as a human. Don't let it take off in such a dark, deep-rooted, self-loathing type of place. You know, I was in that. I was stuck there. And until I got out of that, until I was able to kind of face my own demons, I wasn't able to understand that this isn't a normal way to operate, that the things that you're experiencing are not a normal environment. And it's important to talk about that. It's important to be open about that. And I think that if other people talked about that a little bit more and made it more open and made it more like, my dispatchers know they can walk into my office, they yell, scream, and say some pretty dark things, and we're like, okay, you want to talk now? And it's okay, like, because they're gonna fly off the handle. We're a different breed of human, and I think it's okay, especially at a leadership level, to allow them to have that moment, but also to bring that back a little bit and tell them that you're not firing in that normal space, and let's talk about those things. And really just embrace that with each other, because the only people that are going to understand us are us. Like, you're not going to get that at home, maybe with somebody who might be a teacher. You know, you might not get that there. Or, you know, it's understanding what happens in 911, and that we go through these extremes. Like, we get a 911 call, we're here, and then we hang up the phone and we're here, and then we get a 911 call, we're here. We don't get the response to understand what's happening, to put your brain around what's happening, and then get to the call, render aid, and then come back down from that while we're writing the report. We're here all day, every day, and this isn't a normal place to operate. And we do that in our home life, and we don't know that we do it with a lot of things. And I think that if we open up more and we speak about it in these spaces, if you have the opportunity to get on a podcast somewhere and just talk about it, more and more people will understand. I mean, my blog, I had no idea that people felt that way and that they'd experienced those things. But if you say them out loud, people will be able to also embrace that. And I think that's really important, is say it out loud. It's okay to be out loud about your struggles, your vices, how you manage that stress. Say it out loud so that other people, maybe it'll work for them.
Absolutely. And before we move to Valerie, I just, you know, that is something that we're going to circle back around near the end there, because again, you are someone in a leadership position. So it's so important, like, as you said, setting that tone of talking about it, and from the top down for your own director. And I know that resonates with me, because I have a director, Melissa Alterio, even our deputy director of admin and education, Robbie McCormick. These are people who believe firmly in peer support and building a culture of resilience and talking about it and communicating these things. So that resonates with me, and the fact of what you're doing, setting that tone, like you said, recognizing this isn't normal. It's normal to have those feelings, but it's not normal to live with these feelings, right? And to just think that you have to live with that. So, and we're going to circle back around, Keely, and even talk about, you know, from a leadership perspective, what are you doing and what can other leaders do in their centers? But moving on to now, Valerie. Valerie, now you come from, again, worn the headset, and now you're in a position where this is something that you're still passionate about: wellness, true wellness and resiliency, and building that culture and building, you know, that type of mindset of how, you know, to protect ourselves and to protect our minds. Valerie, what does it look like to you? What has it looked like when you've been in those situations? And I know you have a story to tell. Wish we had more time for anyone who has not read your blog, but what does it look like and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, well, I'm glad Keely brought up about how the dark humor plays into it and the dark places. I think a lot of things we do in public safety is we dehumanize ourselves. We put these calluses on so that we don't feel the feelings. I know many of us were told during our training to do that. That's what you do. You become non-human. You basically become a robot. You answer the phone. You do the thing. You don't put any emotion in it. You just do it. You do it 100% correct every time, and then you move on to the next. And I think that does something to people. You come home and you also bring that non-human content with you. You get at your family gatherings. You also, you just become something that kind of just goes through the motions and doesn't feel the emotions anymore. And I mean, I really think that's something that we should look at more in our trainings when we're bringing dispatchers on. I think we need to bring back more of a culture that it's expected to be human now. We are humans doing human work. We're saving humans. So I really think I really can't focus enough on the human part of it. But I think how it showed up for me is one of those things like you don't really know you're in it, the full effect of it, until you're out of it. You don't know how hot that water has gotten until you're out. So, and how it shows up for me still today is a lot of times with my boss, I will second guess myself. I ask permission for little things that she thinks I shouldn't have to be asking permission for, and will constantly remind me, Valerie, I want to empower you to know that I trust your judgment and that you can do this without running it by me. But from where I came from, it was years of taking initiative seemed to be the wrong thing to do. It's not that it wasn't appreciated. It was a step further to where it was discouraged. Like, do not do that. You will be punished. Do not show any more initiative, Valerie. While you're at it, just keep your mouth shut. We're tired of hearing your ideas. You are just a police communications officer. You're not even a CTO, which is the communications training officer. I was told many times to stay in my lane, what my place was. And so when I did my interview with this new position in wellness, and wellness was something that I already had a passion for to begin with, but I sat down with my new prospective employers, and no joke, I felt more heard, seen, and respected in that job interview than I did in my 13 years of employment. I never felt seen. I never felt heard. I felt that all they ever wanted me to do is keep my mouth closed. And I'm talking about from people who had a high school diploma and tried to belittle me and wear me down every single day. So I did. I got worn down. I thought less and less of myself. Each day I went into the time clock. I just felt less and less. And it was when my wife came along and she started seeing how it changed me and how, I guess, just she wanted better for me. She knew that I was better than how I was being treated. So it took a lot of courage, because I think one thing we also do in the dispatch world and public safety in general is we wrap so much of our identity into the job. And I was scared. I didn't know who I was without that job. I thought I had all this history here. I've put so much into it. This is what, I love doing this. It was so hard for me to leave the job because I was so passionate about the job and I loved doing it, but I could not thrive at that workplace. And it's not that I didn't try. I mean, I went as far as I could in leadership. And when I finally realized I would never be heard there, that I would always have to keep my head down, I finally realized it was time to get out. And that's what I did. But so for me, my story isn't about answering the horrible 911 calls. It isn't about most of that traumatic stuff that you particularly think about when you think of 911 and public safety. Mine was just more so the workplace culture that could happen anywhere. But I think coupled with being 911, it does kind of escalate it a little bit more, because we're expected to have such a good mindset to be able to answer these phone calls and to deal with that effectively. And when you can't support your workforce to be in the good mindset, I think you're just setting them up to fail. So I'm going to wrap that up right there.
Wow. Sarah, she's over there listening and she's commenting. And as she said, you are so strong. That's some kind of vulnerable right there. I'm a Brene Brown fan. I tell you what, my director put me onto her books, and she always talks about being vulnerable and facing yourself the way you faced yourself, the way Keely talked about having those conversations and facing yourself and kind of being honest with yourself. That hits deep. That hits deep. And wow. So from the head, we're headset heroes, right? This is our week. Y'all put it into words. Keely, Valerie, that's what we can resonate. That's what we feel. We don't think terms of PTSD. We may not know all those scientific terms, but those things are what we feel. Whether feeling underappreciated, whether we feel like, as you said, like you don't have a voice, or you have a voice, but no one is listening to you. All of that can get wrapped up as one. And basically, we all have a story to tell. And if you don't have that power or feel empowered to share your story, it can be a very lonely place. And it can lead to that depression and to that burnout and to having all those feelings. And now coming to Dr. Hayes, Dr. Megan Hayes, tell us. We talked, we had a conversation before, you and Sarah, and we talked about how we know it's not about labeling. It's not about it's just, just terms and everything. But when we have these definitions and when we can realize there is a science behind what we're feeling, don't have to feel as lonely. You don't have to feel like this is just an isolated thing. You don't have to feel like you're crazy. There's a science to it. What you're feeling, others have felt before. And maybe once we have these terms and definitions, we can actually address it and know how to treat it. So Dr. Hayes, talking about all these feelings, give us those words, give us these definitions. Why do we feel the way we do? What is all that?
Sure. And, Keely and Valerie, I really appreciate, as everyone mentioned, your vulnerability. It's very refreshing. Valerie kind of knows, in medicine, that's another area where vulnerability isn't always, appreciated, and the culture is still, trying to change. And we in the Office of Wellness are trying to work on that culture. So, there's a lot of parallels between, it sounds like, 911 dispatching and what kind of the culture of medicine as well, keeping your head down, always having to bring top-notch performance, not making any mistakes, perfectionism, feeling undervalued. There are a lot of those things that make medicine and healthcare a tough landscape. It sounds like also can make, being a 911 dispatcher a pretty tough landscape as well. So I appreciate you guys sharing that with me. And I'm just glad to hear that you're feeling, differently now, feeling more valued in better situations. So that's very glad to hear. And we're so happy to have Valerie in our office. What we were talking about beforehand, Sam, was, one thing that I always try to talk to people about is kind of the difference between, okay, there's PTSD, right? And there's a diagnosis of PTSD, but you can also have more like PTSD symptoms because, of course, as a 911 dispatcher, anyone in that job is going to have been exposed to trauma. You're exposed to trauma time and time again, right? In fact, in the criteria, one of the criteria for trauma exposure is indirect exposure in the course of duties in your profession, right? And so that is exactly what you're dealing with as a 911 dispatcher. So you're hearing a verse of details, a lot of details. You're overhearing things as they're playing out. So you're witnessing or you're being exposed to those aversive details of the trauma. So absolutely you're exposed to trauma day in, day out, right? Now, one important thing to point out is, of course, not everyone, and in fact, not even the majority of people who are exposed to trauma develop PTSD as a diagnosis, right? They wouldn't meet the full-blown criteria for PTSD. Most people are exposed to trauma. They might have a few of the symptoms, right after a particularly difficult case or a phone call or event. But in natural recovery, those symptoms are going to kind of die down a little bit and eventually resolve. Now, in the course of PTSD as a diagnosis, these symptoms are not going to resolve. In fact, they're going to continue and possibly worsen and start to cause you a lot of problems in your personal life, as well as potentially in your work responsibilities as well, right? So that's where we see PTSD. But I always want to point out that there's a large group of people who could be experiencing just some subclinical, subthreshold symptoms of PTSD that do bother them and do get in their way. And Keely actually pointed out one thing that I always recommend to that group in particular, and it can also be helpful for those with that full-blown diagnosis of PTSD, which is journaling, right? Writing. So therapeutic journaling is one excellent way to process traumatic experiences that helps to really put things into context. And Keely also mentioned the importance, as did Valerie, of sharing experiences and being vulnerable, right? Because one thing that keeps PTSD symptoms going is not processing things, not talking about it, keeping it all inside, avoiding thinking about it, avoiding anything that's going to remind you about it. So it's so important to process it. So whether that's verbally or with writing or both, those are actually some really great ways to try to help process and resolve some of these traumatic experiences that people are going through.
Oh, wow. Wow. So I love how you pointed out the difference that what is PTSD versus, so it's not that, well, it's just one got to be completely sometimes it is just the symptoms of such, but not necessarily PTSD. That is really, so in your experience, let me ask you, Dr. Hayes, who do you work with that? Do you work with first responders that, deal with this? And is it hard for you, or how have you been able to communicate with them? They have these symptoms, because on our side of 911, sometimes it's hard for us to accept. We think, well, no, I don't see it. I'm on the other end. I'm just hearing it. You don't necessarily think that I deal with trauma. We deal with trauma. And even just hearing it and filling in like we do because we don't get the closure that we need, that is trauma. How do you communicate with that? And for peer supporters, in layman's term, how can we communicate that to the people we work with, that, yes, that is trauma that you deal with?
Well, I think first and foremost, just validating that the work that you do, you're exposed to trauma every day, right? For the most part. I think let's just put it out there. Trauma exposure is the name of the game in the type of work that you are doing, and it's going to happen day in, day out. So there's really no question of whether the people that are working with you or for you are being exposed to trauma. They absolutely are, right? It's a matter of, okay, as Keely was talking about, if you're noticing symptoms in someone you're working with and you're worried about them, right? Or someone, if you're in a leadership role and they work for you, having the courage, right? I'm also a Brene Brown vet, so daring greatly, right? Having the courage to just say something, right? Yes. To just say, friend, I've noticed that your humor is a little darker these days. I'm a big dark humor fan myself as well. But that concerns me a little bit. I'm wondering how things are going for you. How are they really going? Right? Kind of asking those open-ended questions, having those check-ins. You can't force anyone to tell you what's going on in their lives, but you can create a culture where vulnerability is not only acceptable, but encouraged, right? And you can also create a culture of psychological safety where people know that they can be open without fear of repercussion, looking soft, or people thinking that they're not good at their jobs because they're human. right? So those are really important things that you can do to open the door. You're not in a role of diagnosing that person. So you can take the pressure off there. You could, use terms like, of course, in our job, we're exposed to a lot of trauma. Sounds like some of that could be impacting you, right? Have you ever considered talking to someone about it? Do you want to talk to me a little bit about it? I've got some resources here. Here's some, numbers you could call or people you could go to if this is really impacting you. So you don't have to worry about getting outside of the scope of your job or what, your role is. You could have some resources ready to go, but simply saying something and pointing out you've noticed a change or that the person may not be totally themselves can really go a long way, because they feel not only that someone's kind of looking out for them, but that they're not going to be, again, silenced, or that it's unsafe, that you're a safe person because you're proactively going to them.
I love that. I love that. And we have a commenter, Miss Stacy Day. She brings up a really great point. She mentions that dispatchers should always be invited to the debriefing with police, fire, and EMS after any major incident. And if I could like that 1,000 times over, it is so, so important. And it's something that we do at our agency, and it just makes a world of a difference. And I want to go ahead and circle back to you, Keely, two things. Kind of address that if you want, because I'm going to ask Valerie as well, how important it is for our 911 professionals to be included in debriefings. But I want you to talk a little bit again, kind of from a leadership perspective, why does from the top down we need to be facilitating these conversations and talking real talk on PTSD? Every leader in the industry can't get on these podcasts and do this or write blogs like you did, but they need to be doing something towards this fight. So Keely, talk a little more about what you do specifically in your leadership role as executive director of your agency and why other leaders need to be doing the same.
So I think we need to understand that firing in this space is not singular, right? So I can sit on my throne, if you will, and talk. I'm sorry, the wind is just fabulously blowing my hair. So I could talk about it ad nauseum, right? Like I could talk about it all day, every day, but if it's not embraced by the culture, by our environment, it's never going to go anywhere. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this isn't a singular mindset. This is understanding that nothing we do occurs in a vacuum. We're not here. We're going to broad spectrum this, and we're going to understand that this goes beyond just our room, just the four corners of our walls, just the environment that we sit in. We need to understand that when we experience whatever the event is that is big enough to allow debriefing teams to come in and help our police officers, our firefighters, our EMTs that are in the street, but that also means that the people that took the original call were experienced in the moment. And I talk about this a lot, and I talk about this with my dispatchers. What we get is in the moment response. We get whatever that dispatcher took, that call that they took, was experienced in the moment with the caller. So the horror, their child not breathing, their discovery moment is with the dispatcher, right? Because the first thing that they think to do is to dial 911 because they don't know what else to do when it happens. And I talk about the beauty of that. There's a beauty in that, that we're going to be the first person that they think in that moment to call. But what happens? We are experiencing it as they're processing that, right? So if you can imagine what they're experiencing as the first-hand person that's on scene, that's dealing with the moment in that traumatic experience, in that trauma, we have to understand that we're experiencing that with them. We're talking them off the ledge a little bit. We're trying to get them to figure out how to help the individual that might need help, or what they've just witnessed is it's okay. I need you to breathe through it. I need you to give me information because I need to protect now my first responders, because our situation is not just here. We're kind of going in this, we need to make sure that the caller has everything they need from us, but we need to make sure that the first responders that are going to get out there have everything they need to protect themselves, because we believe that their heartbeats are tethered to our desks, right? Mm-hmm. And then if they don't go home at night, that's us, right? Like if we can't send them home to their families in that moment, that we have somehow failed. And
Yes.
so I think that you have to understand that when that moment happens, when that big experience happens, that it's not just singular. We're talking, it goes sort of into this V moment where it's going to expand into the spaces, and we're going to deal with the caller and when the first responders are going out there. So we need to make sure that both people are safe, both things are happening at both times, that these things are happening concurrently. And so what we're experiencing is that moment of trauma and that moment of, is everybody going to get there and be okay and go home to their families? And I think that that speaks volumes about who we are as individuals to handle that moment, and to also understand that that's why debriefing is so important. And I'm going to tell a very quick debriefing story that I had many years ago that involved somebody's daughter that I knew. I took a 911 call that I knew the individual, and the daughter, it's one of my moments where I wake up in the middle of the night breathing and breathing hard. And the thing about that is that two things happened. Is that I understood that the individual that I was on the phone with, I identified myself so she would calm down and start talking to me because she was screaming. And I had to tell her that I knew who she was and that everything was going to be okay, right? And that we're gonna find her daughter. And that moment to me was experiencing the trauma with her. She has found her daughter who is missing. She can't find her daughter, right? And then in the background, I've dispatched everybody and their mother, and I now have the police officer who is screaming for more help. And in that moment, he does not answer the radio. So my moment was not just singularly to her, it was also, why is my officer not answering the radio? Did he come across the person that had the child? Did something happen? And so I think what ends up happening is we have that singular line that everybody thinks that we're supposed to experience. And to Valerie's point, there's sort of this narcissistic undertone that, like, we're supposed to just deal with it and shut up and stay in your lane. And in my debriefing moment, I talk about, they started with me, the dispatcher. What did you hear? What did you hear? What did you smell? What did you taste? What happened in your moment in that briefing? Mm-hmm. And I also was worried about my officer. And so that's what I said during my debriefing, is I said I could not, I didn't know where my officer was, so I thought something was wrong with him. And immediately the officer across the room scoffed, and he was like, we obviously knew there was something wrong with the child. And I will never forget that moment, because it was like, I didn't know that. Why would I know that? I'm on the phone. I can't see what's happening. And you know, maybe there's something that speaks to like incident related imagery and that we could maybe see things, but I couldn't see anything. I didn't know. I was depending on my officer to tell me why he was screaming for more help, and I had nothing. So immediately my day stopped, and I immediately started thinking about my police officer and what was happening with my police officer. And I will never forget the state trooper who was doing that incident debriefing. And that state trooper who said to me, who actually stopped the debriefing, and he said, excuse me, sir, you do not have the microphone and you do not have the moment. And he was like, because that dispatcher, that moment, wow, she believed that the only thing that mattered was your life. And she thought something was wrong with you. And I think that that speaks volumes about her character, and immediately how she transitioned from the person she knew, the caller on the phone, the person that was a priority to her, had now shifted to you, your safety, and what happens next. And you were not answering her. You failed her in that moment. And so while I think that debriefings are something that needs to happen, they need to happen specific to our dispatch center. And that while, yes, we should be included in the environment in which happens to all the rest of the first responders that are happening in that moment, we need to understand that that is not, our moments are different. We're experiencing them in two facets, in two, you know, like I'd like to talk about it looking like a diamond and how it kind of goes in different directions. And that was something that occurred in that moment to me, was understanding that this guy, this state trooper who was doing my incident debriefing, understood that I was experiencing that in two places. I was experiencing it with the person who I knew on the phone and my police officer who I obviously knew and worked with every single day. And that I couldn't help him and I couldn't help her. And what that must have been like, the traumatic experience I had in that moment. So as a leader of an organization, I do believe that you need to be in that moment so that they understand that what I experienced was twofold, but also with other people, other members of our community that understand that what we're experiencing is firsthand, because they get 4 to 7 minutes, depending on national average and where you sit in the world of the nation, right? And our response times. But you're experiencing that in a it's sort of like capturing the moment as it occurs and capturing the process that person's having with you on the phone, and then also capturing the process that your first responders are having. And ours is different because, again, experiencing it here and here and here and here is different than experiencing it in a hill, right? So while, yes, you have to make sure that your dispatcher is a part of that, you also have to make sure that there are people that speak that language at your debriefing teams. And fortunately for me, in that debriefing moment, I had a state trooper who understood that moment, because any other police officer, and I hate to say this because I know there might be police officers in our forum here or previous officers who become dispatchers. I just want to say that he understood that what I experienced was not just singular. And if I don't have more people that are speaking in that language who understand how I speak, that's not going to help me process the events that go forward, or process how I experience that moving into my life. Because still to this day, I have guilt on both sides that I wasn't able to help that. And I feel like, thank God for that trooper, or thank the universe, whatever you believe. Thank God that he understood that, like, I was experiencing that in two places. And if we aren't able to have those conversations and able to have those debriefing teams who are specific to our peer support, it's going to be lost in the moment, because a normal police officer would have been like, you're just a dispatcher. What do you know? You just experienced it on the phone. And that's not what I experienced. I experienced that internally because my heart started screaming when the police officer didn't answer the radio. And I want everybody to understand that this is, you're processing the trauma with the caller, you're processing the first responders getting on scene, and then you can't do anything to help, right? You're like restricted. So that 4 to 7 minutes, you're processing it with the caller. And then when they're on scene, it's radio silence, right? Like, how many times you get the mic click? And that's a terrible place to sit. And so to make sure that whoever is speaking for you, or who is ever taking those moments on that critical incident, you need to make sure they speak your language, make sure that they understand how you're processing that. And I also know that there's a ton of people, and I actually just see it under an anonymous post, I didn't even mean to do that, that a lot of dispatchers refuse that debriefing. Please make sure that your dispatchers don't refuse. And even if they sit in your office and they just talk about what it is, make sure that they're at least talking it out. We will remove people from the floor and make them go talk it out if something just occurs. That's something, especially during our business hours, when we're open, we make sure that people are pulled from the floor and they talk about it. Or we go out there and we sit with them and we sit on the floor while they're still doing their job and talk about it. I feel like that's a priority. You have to make sure that happens, and you shouldn't allow them to refuse, because it's going to take it from somebody who knows. It's going to haunt you 10, 15 years later. Make sure they talk about it. And even if all they do is talk about it, that's it. Like, they don't want to talk about it ever again, that's fine. But you have to understand what they're experiencing in the moments after it happens. I had my deputy director years ago. She took a child not breathing. I immediately disconnected my radio, and I went and sat with her and disconnected her radio and slid her back from her terminal and let her breathe through that. Do that. If you have to force it to happen, it's okay.
Oh, wow. And this is why it was so important to get that perspective from you, as someone in a leadership role who cares about that and can instill that in their people. And as we definitely want to I want to get Valerie's and Dr. Hayes' perspective as well with debriefings, because I want to also talk about the importance of having clinicians there, having that other, that person that can be that voice of that expertise and be able to, again, put words to it, put terms to it of what they're going through. And so I love the idea of the debriefings and peer support sessions and all of that, where what we are in peer support, we're just listeners. But how important is it as well in bringing in clinicians or people with that clinical experience, with that scientific experience in these debriefings as well? And I do want to quickly, that was a really great question that and thank you for addressing that, Keely. I believe it was Josephine that mentioned about how to deal with if your dispatchers are saying, no, I don't want to attend the debriefing. One thing I would also point out, the power of one. It's you take one person who has attended a debriefing, two people who have, and use them to share that with other people and say, hey, I went to a debriefing. It's not what you think. It's not a hate, not judgment. It is a safe haven. Because sometimes as a leader, you pass it down as much as you can, but just hearing from your own person that, yes, I went to the debriefing and it was a really powerful experience, profound experience. But talking about that, Valerie, and then we're going to end up with you, Dr. Hayes. Valerie, why is it important, you would say, to have people with some clinical experience in those debriefings as well, listening and taking part and being able to help out as well? Valerie, you're on mute. Just unmute yourself. Thank you. I hear your beautiful voice, Missy.
We have to do more than just invite the dispatchers to debriefings. It needs to be mandatory, because there's a culture of safety, and if you make yourself vulnerable in a lot of these public safety positions to where you need help and need to debrief on something, you're seen less than, and that could affect possible promotions or what your future looks like within the department. I know people who would probably pass up on debriefings if they had a choice, just because they would be afraid of how it would reflect upon them. I don't know. I can't say for certain if I was invited or not, but I can tell you I was never in any type of debriefing. And I mean, we had some serious events. We had the April 27, 2011 tornado that tore through Alabama. Tuscaloosa areas were obliterated, and it was right beside campus. We lost students. We lost Tuscaloosa citizens. We lost hundreds in Alabama that day. We took phone calls, and we were told we had to do so much with pen and paper because all kinds of things didn't work. We just had a tornado come through our town. So we were trying to keep a list of confirmed dead. We were told not to tell parents yet that these people were dead, because we like to make those in person when we can, those death notifications. So I know that there was a parent that called checking on their kid because they hadn't heard from them, and there was their name plain as day on that piece of paper. I knew they were dead, but my supervision said I couldn't tell them. So, that was something that still sticks with me. That was pretty tough. But yeah, we did a lot of, we did 12-hour shifts, I think maybe with one off day, for I think 6 weeks. We did a lot of work. It was a lot. I also had a friend in the agency who ended up dying by suicide, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't invited to any type of debriefing for that. But I just think the value in being heard, and no debriefing is going to fix anything. It's not going to fix you. It's not going to keep these traumas from coming up later in your life. But there is value in that moment in knowing that your agency cares and that you have a place to talk. And the importance, Sam, of having some type of clinician or certified person such as Dr. Hayes to hear you out, I believe would add an extra 100 steps of value to that. I know a lot of times in public safety, we have like chaplains, some type of retired minister, something like that, that sometimes it could be good for our job, sometimes maybe not so much. I don't know if ours ever got utilized that much. We also have makeshift peer supports in a lot of agencies. I think we're getting better with actually sending people to classes where they get certified now. And I've heard with some agencies how they don't feel safe or comfortable speaking in their peer support because of their peer support committees. They aren't people who they feel free to go to and be open with. So I think that's another thing to look at when you're selecting your committees, to make sure it's people that the members feel comfortable with. And I know we're getting close on our time. So Sam, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. And Dr. Hayes, if you'd finish off again, the importance of having that certified or that clinical person who can put in words, why is it so important to have a Dr. Hayes in the room, when we're having these debriefings and these kind of sessions?
Yeah, and I'd be interested, I could talk to Valerie about this later, but how common is that, to have a mental health provider in these types of debriefings for, first responders and dispatchers? This is something that I have actually been intimately involved in the healthcare setting, especially during the Delta wave of COVID, when a lot of our learners, like residents and medical students, were intimately involved in like the COVID ICUs. And during the Delta wave, a lot of, for instance, pregnant women were dying, daily. It was like young folks. It was just a really rough wave around here. And I did a lot of trauma debriefings with those ICU workers, and that was kind of my primary experience with debriefings. I think it was beneficial for a number of reasons, but I also know that kind of from what I know from the literature, why are debriefings helpful? I think number one, it does give people a safe space to have feelings validated, to process through feelings. They don't need to necessarily relive all the entire incident, but I think it's helpful to, as some other people in the chat were commenting, like fill in some of the pieces, because you isn't only are one individual and you have your perception of what happened. And if you don't have everyone else to kind of put things into context and to look at the facts, you may walk away with a certain perception of what happened that is skewed by a lot of self-blame. Right. And that's what we don't want. Either that feeling of helplessness or somehow believing you could have done something differently. And I think that's where a debriefing can help to say, look, we were all in this together. We did everything that we could, and putting all of those facts into context. Right. Because feelings are not facts. But at the same time, having a professional there could help with like, hey, education, these feelings are normal. Here are some things you may experience in the coming days. Anyone who's exposed to a significant and complex trauma is going to have at least a few of these symptoms. And a debriefing is not meant to be the primary form of treatment. It's really meant to be, let's review what happened. Let's put it into context. Here's some things you might experience. And if you do develop some problematic symptoms, here's some resources for you. And I think that can really help, and to help people feel not alone.
Oh, wow. Everything that you're saying, just absolutely amazing. As we wrap this up here, give it to me, everyone, in one sentence. Takeaway, Keely, one takeaway for our people here.
Don't be afraid to talk.
Absolutely.
Please do that for yourselves.
Love it. Valerie.
If you don't feel comfortable where you are, find a place where you do feel comfortable.
Amen to that. Dr. Megan Hayes.
Don't push away feelings. What we resist persists.
I love it. And I'm going to borrow from Sarah with this one. Empowered people, empower people. Empower each other to take care of each other and to really get better and have these hard conversations like the four of y'all had this amazing conversation. And I thank y'all absolutely for joining us, this amazing panel. Keely, Heyman, Valerie Miner, Dr. Megan Hayes. It's amazing. Sarah Weston. Sarah, she's hanging off in the wing there for putting this amazing Empower panel together again. Hey, Sarah.
I'm gonna go around with applause. I don't know how to get out of the wing. Hold on. Oh no, I put Keely up there. I didn't mean to. You guys. It's a new version of Crowdcast. I don't know if you noticed. We're doing the best we can. That was absolutely incredible. Thank you all. Join us next time. We'll have more. As always, you can catch this in replay. You can share it with your friends on our YouTube channel and podcast. I'm still getting used to that, guys, because it's still really cool. But thank you. We'll probably have you all back on again in a couple months because I feel like we need to continue this conversation. But thanks, everyone, and we will see you soon.
Take care, y'all.